If you guys saw my Emerald review, you'll know I absolutely love the game and everything about it. So you'd probably expect to say I was absolutely stoked when I learned we were getting Gen 3 remakes, and you'd be half right. I was quite excited, but having learned my lesson from buying into the hype of X and Y, I was cautiously optimistic. I didn't end up getting the game until a few years after release, and I'll be honest, in my initial playthrough, I wasn't the biggest fan. But that was mainly because I just beat Sapphire and Emerald in preparation, so I was most likely burnt out on hoeing by the time I got to Mega Ruby. Of course it's been a few years, so now I can look at this game with a fresh and new perspective, so let's get into it.
When looking at a remake, the first thing you look out for is a presentation. In terms of graphics, this game is really impressive, and despite having a similar style to X and Y, and most likely being made with the same engine, I'd say this game is leaps and bounds ahead of the other Gen 6 games. Maybe it's just because I'm a hoeing fanboy, but the way the colours pop and the way everything looks vibrant and full of life, despite the somewhat stilted character animations, really brings me joy. Some people do have gripes with the colour palette used and such, and while I do understand that, I'm not too fussed about it personally, because overall the detail and polish is there, and that's enough for me.
On the music front, almost every track has been revamped, and maybe it's just because I'm a stickler for those GBA trumpets, but I'm not a huge fan of every recomposition here. Don't get me wrong, they're excellent recreations, but my heart belongs to the OST of the originals. And despite my praise for the graphics, yes, I also prefer the GBA graphics. What can I say, I'm an old man about these things. Actually, while we're on the topic of presentation, with new graphics come new designs for a lot of the characters. I'm not too fussed about the protagonist redesigns, but what I'm more puzzled about is the evil leaders. Max is pretty similar to how he initially looked, but what the fuck is up with Archie? Why is he black? Not that there's anything wrong with that, you know what I mean. It's just a really weird and jarring change. He went from this to this. You told me that ain't weird.
Why am I black?
Although with the new redesigns come new admins and they're awesome. I'm not going to spoil too much, but it's needless to say that they add a lot to the game.
Actually, all of the side characters do, since they all have expanded roles with a lot more dialogue and personality than before. Especially both of your rivals. Wally got a decent upgrade, and at the cost of spoiling the surprise a bit, his final battle is fucking epic. May and Brendan are also a lot more involved with you during the story, and they even added some romantic implications in there. While it does give them a lot more personality, initially it was kind of frustrating for me, because early on, they pop up really frequently, leading to a lot more start and stop when compared to the originals, but it's really not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. Along with character changes, a lot of the locations in the game got changed around a bit, if not completely replaced with a whole new look. Like Morville, for example. I hate the change to Morville personally, it's just really fucking ugly. Morville wasn't some beautiful jaw-dropping locale to begin with, but I'll take the original over whatever the fuck this is.
Now you may be wondering why they changed so much with this game being a remake, but that's where this game is different. It's more of a reimagining than a remake. This version of Hoenn isn't the one you know. This Hoenn is from a different timeline where Mega Evolutions exist, and Groudon and Kyogre go all primal on our asses. And this is shown throughout your adventure with all of the differences I mentioned, as well as one of the biggest additions to this game, the Delta episode.
I'm not going to spoil the Delta episode here, but for those who are unaware, it's a short side story that involves you saving the world, and it's a nice little addition to the post game if you ask me. While it is kinda interesting and grand, it was never really something I cared much about, because past explaining why Megas exist in the Hoenn region now, it doesn't really add enough for me to be invested on a personal level.
And while we're on the topic of the post game, most of you are probably wondering if they brought the Battle Frontier back. Spoiler alert, they didn't. This had fans absolutely up in arms at the time, and it wasn't helped by the fact Junichi Masuda's reasoning was questionable at best. I mean, really? This sounds like something my out-of-touch grandpa would say. No wonder this stupid take has become so infamous. But honestly, it wasn't that a huge a loss when you compare it to all of the additions, tweaks, and story changes that they added to the game. However, it was indicative of Game Freak's future laziness and unwillingness to adapt and give the fans what they want. And that kind of describes this game as a whole, to be honest. Fans wanted a straight remake with a bunch of new additions and a bunch of carryovers from Emerald like the Battle Frontier. What we got instead was some weird retelling that shits on the original while somehow still shitting on itself. At the time, people loved these games, much like X and Y, but much like the Kalos games, time has been too kind to these remakes and people are starting to sour on them. While I don't really despise them like X and Y, I still do prefer the originals over them. And part of that is because these are two different experiences that tell two different stories, with wildly different pacing and progression. So for that reason, I'm not sure if I could recommend these games if you haven't played the originals. While I think these are worth playing, if you're a die-hard Hoenn fan like me, you might be disappointed, so I'd say keep your expectations in check if you do decide to try them.